Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Jim Harrison. Um, have a really interesting presentation for you today, and in a way, it coincides with we're in December and winter holidays, December holidays, but specifically today is the winter solstice, unless unless you happen to be in the southern hemisphere. Then it would be the summer solstice. And I guess if you're smack on the equator, you're in the eternal equinox, right? Is that the way that works? I don't know. I live in northern hemisphere, winter solstice, shortest day of the year. And it really builds up for the celebration on December 25th, which is the first visible day that the days start getting longer, which is what the December 25th holiday was originally all about, was agricultural communities celebrating that the longer days, birth of the sun god, all different ways of explaining that. And eventually that became the birth of Jesus Christ, which happens on December 25th. So Merry Christmas to everyone who celebrates. It's also Happy Hanukkah right now, Happy Hanukkah season, and all the other celebrations that are going on at the end of the year. Right now, today, winter solstice, I think this is a very fitting topic. I am Jim Harrison. I've been working with essential oils for 30 years or so. And I am, I've done a little bit of everything. So my background is really extensive, which gave me a fairly unique perspective of aromatherapy essential oils. I mean, I've owned a spa, so I was a clinician. That's actually when I found out about essential oils. I've been an educator forever, and I have also done product formulation. I had a plant-based skincare company here in the United States, and I still formulate for other companies, mostly the essential oil blends. So my background really brings in a lot of different information. I'm going to share my perspective on the topic of today, which first of all, let me just show you. If you want to get in touch with me, that's it. That's how you do it. info@jimharrison.com. How easy is that? And this is what I'm going to do today. Okay, we're going to talk about, I want to get rid of that guy too, so that it's not in the way. There, not in the way. I like it when it works that way. I like it when it's easy. I like it when it works, actually, in general. Okay, so the topic for today, essential oils and spirituality. We're going to be talking about experience, the science of understanding spirituality and how we feel, and the history. What is the history of spirituality? How do we define it? How do we acknowledge it? How do we explain it? And how do we engage with it? So first, before we get there, we need to understand, well, not so much understand, but let's create a definition around what I'm going to be talking about today. And this was interesting. And one of the ways that I came about having a desire to define. So when I was teaching at university, and it was a Bastyr University, a naturopathic holistic medicine university, and there were plaques on the wall talking about holistic. And the definition was our standard definition, which is mind, body, spirit. And because I like to define before we get into topics when I'm educating, so we're basically talking about the same thing. I looked at mind, body, spirit as, how do we define that? What is mind? What is body? Different topic, but what is spirit? And this is such an elusive topic, and it's so individual and personalized in how we define and how we feel and what we experience as spirituality. And so in the topic today, this is not going to be a religious topic. Spirituality kind of created all the religions that we acknowledge throughout the world. And a religion creates guidelines and, in a way, rules for how we practice spirituality. It doesn't necessarily define spirituality. So we're going to define spirituality in this way. It's an experience. This is how we want to define it. We're going to be talking today mostly about the experience of spirituality. And we also are going to be talking about the change in perception that spirituality creates. So spirituality is an experience. It's a change in perception. It's a shift in internal state or internal process or internal feelings, however you want to define that. But there's also physicality. We're going to talk about that as well. And something, this is that felt. This is really important. It's something felt before it's experienced, or before it's explained, or before it's defined, or before we intellectualize it. This is going to be a big point about what spirituality is and how we connect with it, and how does it relate to our philosophy? How does it relate to our thought process? How does it relate to our physical health? This is where we're going to be going with this. Now, let me just go through a few of these people that, so many people have defined spirituality. When you get into the self-help category of wellness, spirituality is a big piece of that. And so we want to define spirituality in a way that defines who we are, what our thought processes are. So William James, from a psychology perspective, defined spirituality as an experience defined by its felt quality, not a doctrine or explanation. So when you get into doctrine and explanation, what we're talking about here is we're talking about religion. We're talking about defining spirituality. We're talking about explaining it. We're talking about creating rules around what spirituality is. So from a psychological perspective, defined by William James, spirituality is an experience. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, philosophy, from a perspective of philosophy, meaning arises through embodied perception before language. Again, we're talking about an experience. Meaning arises through embodied perception. It's about how we perceive the feeling and the experience. And then we therefore are going to define spirituality. But the feeling comes before language, which is a big part of how I'm going to explain the aromatics when we get to that piece. Antonio Damasio, neuroscience. So now we're getting into a little bit of how a neuroscientist would define spirituality, and that is a bodily state and emotion. So it's about the physical state of the body. Where is the body when we're having a spiritual experience? What's the body experiencing? What is the body doing? Where's it going? How's it feel? And then emotion. How do you feel? The spiritual experience. What is the emotion that defines that feeling of spirituality? Here again, in the neuroscience, we're saying it precedes conscious thought. Mircea Eliade, anthropology, or actually more specifically, this would be in the category of phenomenology. So the science of phenomena, which sometimes when we define spiritual experience, we define it as a phenomenon. And so in that definition, it's the sacred appears as a rupture in ordinary perception. A little bit redundant here, and I'm going to continue to be redundant, because in every aspect, from the psychology, from the philosophy, from the neuroscience, from the anthropology, in every category, we are talking about spiritual experience that comes before we define it. It comes before we explain it. It even comes before, and which is really the umbrella for everything I just said, before we intellectualize it. So spirituality is an experience that precedes intellectualization or any kind of definition or dogma or anything else that you want to stick with the spirituality. So here's the common thread. As I was just saying, part of it is that it's not defined, and it precedes intellectual evaluation. So spirituality begins as an experience, not a belief, and it's felt and not defined. I use the word belief there, and I think I'm going to throw this in. I didn't throw it in, but I'm going to throw it in now, okay? Because I say this often, and what I say is I don't believe anything. I don't have a belief system. I don't believe anything. And the way I process information, rather than saying I believe it, I know it. And what I know is based on all the information I have to evaluate whatever that would be as a belief system. I've evaluated it, so I know that information. Now, the information may change, so my knowing may change, just like a belief system. If you have a certain belief system, if you believe in, whatever it is that strong feeling that you have about belief, that can change through your life experiences. What you believe now can change due to your experiences. So this is just another way I define how my process works. And so rather than looking at it as a belief, because a belief system means that you could be wrong. I have to believe it because there's no definition, there's no way of knowing absolute that whatever I believe in is the truth. And if there's no way of knowing that my belief system is the truth, that means I could be wrong. And that makes belief, in a way, elusive and not on secure ground. So a very secure, strong belief system is actually knowing. You know this based on the information that you've accumulated. Now, again, that knowing may change. And when the knowing changes, the belief changes. So in a way, the reason I wanted to explain that, which I hadn't planned on, but I did it anyway, because I get like that sometimes. The reason I wanted to bring that up is because in a way, a lot of what we think about spirituality is a belief system. And it's based on whatever the information is that we've accumulated through our life. And we create the belief system. But in the way I want to define it today is we're going to precede belief, because belief is intellectual. Spirituality, in the way that we're defining it today, precedes intellectual evaluation, meaning it precedes belief. So that's all I'm going to say about belief for now. I might bring it up again. Anyway, it's felt, not defined. It's really what that first bullet point means. Perception and bodily state shift first. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to be redundant. I'm basically saying the same thing. Spirituality begins as an experience. Spirituality is a perception and a bodily state shift that happens again before intellectual evaluation. So this means it precedes meaning and language, which are the things that will follow when we have that experience. And these things happen so quickly. There's such a minute space between the experience and the intellectual evaluation. They appear instant. And so we will automatically try and place meaning and language to follow that perception. As another, I'll teach this in my classes, or I'll explain this in my classes, how we as humans, we like to humanize our experiences because we only have our senses that give us the language and the input to help us understand. And understanding is part of the meaning and part of the intellectualizing. And so if we have this experience happening, we're going to use our senses to explain it. This is a cool thing about the olfactory system. You ever notice we don't have an olfactory language? It comes from our other senses. If we smell something, we may call it cool. And cool is a sensory word. Or smells like rose. Rose is a thing. It's a noun. It's a thing. And these are the languages. These are the words that we use to define scent. They come from our other senses. Visual, feel, whatever. But we don't have a language for scent because, just like spirituality, the olfactory system processes information before we give it meaning, before we intellectualize it, before we try to explain it. So the olfactory system, which is we're going to get into because we're talking aromatics, we're talking about smelling. And the olfactory system, in its relationship to the way we're explaining spirituality, they just mingle so well together. So we'll get into that. Now, the experience is recognized before it is explained. Have I said that oh so many times? So like I said, it's going to be redundant because that's such an important piece here to understand that our spiritual experiences are not something that have meaning. They're not something that has language. They're not something that has any kind of intellectual process. We give that to it after the experience because we try to explain how we feel. We try to explain what's happening in our body. We try to explain all of the philosophy and everything else that comes into our brain, thought process, to define that feeling, the experience of spirituality. This is what we're talking about. Now, where did all this come from? It's old. I actually read, I was trying to do a lot of research so I could give you some, little bit of precision as far as the information that I'm talking about here. And I saw something that was talking about as far back as 1 million years ago, they found there's evidence that humans were creating ritual. They were creating different ways of what we now know produce a spiritual experience. So this goes way, way, way back. It's really like 1500 BC when we hear about the more common aromatics that are used in ritual and prayer, like frankincense and myrrh. That goes back 1500 BC. And, the records still go back even further. Fire was one of the ways that people would experience a spiritual experience. And fire, we've all sat around the fire, right? Especially when you're camping and you're outdoors and you're pretty much just experiencing a small community of people hanging out around a fire. And the fire itself creates a meditative state. And the meditative state, in the way we're going to be explaining this, is similar to a spiritual state. So fire, with the attention, which gives that the transition from your physical body in a physical world, and just watching the fire can take you away from that more physical experience, like meditation. If you meditate, you understand how that works. So fire it's a mantra. Fire is a focus point. We hear this a lot about focus point in meditation. Smoke from resins, woods, plants used to mark sacred space. This is actually a lot in sacred text. There's an abundance of this in the Bible, and in a lot of spiritual stories or philosophical type stories. I talk philosophy. I'm talking Taoism, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. These are more philosophical practices rather than religious or even spiritual practices. But the philosophy brings you to the spiritual, or the spiritual brings you to the philosophy in the way that we're explaining what we're doing today. So that's the little bit of a start for the very, very oldest, most primitive ways of getting into a spiritual state that, there's historical records of. In the Bible, you find a lot of anointing oils mentioned. And, in other books as well, you find spiritual text, of course, the Quran, and even the Bhagavad Gita. Does that have anointing? I think it does, but I don't remember. It's a long time since I read that. Anyway, anointing oils applied to the body. This is actually a practice of getting into a spiritual state. And we'll talk a little bit more about how those are still practiced even today. A lot of these were done for protection, for healing, and for ceremony. And so to bring you into a healing state, in a way, it actually brings you into a spiritual space where when you can get beyond thought, that can really help the healing process. And especially if you get into a spiritual state that we'll talk about the neuroscience again of spiritual state, but there's certain neurotransmitters that have a positive health effect on our body. So that would relate to the healing. In protection, this is all very subjective, I guess. But we find that protection was also a large amount of spiritual practice, spiritual energetic protection, and the ceremony. And this is basically when we think about religions and practice, spiritual practice, it's mostly about ceremony and ritual. Repetition and movement. I mean, I have the Sufis here with the spinning. That's a practice of getting into what we consider a meditative state or a spiritual state. Sound, chanting, these are all still in practice today. And these are things that are very much engaging us physically to bring us into that meditative spiritual state, which again, when we talk the neuroscience, you're going to understand what I'm referring to when I say that. So repetition of movement, sound, or chant is definitely something we're still in practice today and has been around for millennia. It's just a really long time. Okay, it goes, the historical records really dip back deep into the BC, and does it go back a million years? I'm not sure if that does, but it's definitely part of it. Ritual actions performed within designated spaces, caves, and temples. Caves, of course, is where you're going to find the historic records that go deep into our human past. Temples, still popular. You can go to the temples, and these temples are designed around practices. Generally, we think of them as religious practices that, of course, bring us into a spiritual state. Church, there's an experience that I was brought up Italian Catholic, the Boston area, hardcore Catholic. I thought everyone was when I was growing up. And, we go to church, and I really enjoyed especially the Christmas, and I think it was Easter, they would do this too, when, not every Sunday would they do this, but, on the major holidays, it would bring out the frankincense. And I just love that scent. Now, since being a Catholic, that turned me basically into an atheist, and that would be, mostly due to the dogma. I found that the dogma and the rules based around religion took away from the spiritual experience of what I thought religion was supposed to be all about. Now, I have done a lot of extensive reading and philosophical research where, I wouldn't call myself an atheist, though I think atheist is kind of a funny thing, because atheism, wouldn't that mean you'd have to believe in a God that you don't believe in if you're an atheist? I mean, it's kind of a weird topic anyway. But, I'm kind of getting into the elusiveness of spirituality. And again, when we start defining it, what I'm saying is we get away from it. And so these rituals are designed to bring us into that spiritual experience, not into any kind of definition of the spiritual experience, but the things that are going to talk about the neuroscience and how what it actually is, what a spiritual experience would actually be from a physical and emotional perspective. So the neuroscience, this is where we start talking about that. What is all this about? Ancient ritual practices consistently narrow or stabilize attention. Again, if you meditate, you know exactly what we're talking about here, because the whole practice of meditation is to stabilize our attention, to monkey mind, try to get the monkey mind to, just sort of pass, watch the thoughts go by, kind of a thing. Our meditation is about being, stabilizing a spiritual experience. A lot of these spiritual practices are designed around this narrowing, so we live in a world that's just, I was trying to keep my hands on the screen. We live in a world that is so expansive and full of noise, right? Especially now, it is just so full of noise. And the idea of a modern spiritual practice is not to close that down. It definitely is to narrow our attention, but it's about erasing all that noise. It's about quieting it. It's about putting it into a background where you're not paying attention to it anymore. Does it go away? Maybe the yogis are really good at it, getting to that space of what they call quiet mind. Not me. It's, the noise is all there. I've just in my practice learned how to narrow and stabilize my attention. There's a shift in breath rhythm. When we talk about narrowing and stabilizing attention, the physical effect that it has on us is to shift the breath. Breathing is another practice to bring us into a spiritual state. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And so the practice of watch the breath, or however you define that, the breathing exercises, you breathe in, hold the breath, or breathe out, hold the breath, count, whatever. These are attention given to the breath. When you've gone through that process, as you get into a deeper meditative state, you will get into where the breath is doing what it does in that state of meditative relaxation, spiritual state. The breath will shift naturally into the rhythm that works best of being in that, neurobiological state that we're going to be talking about. The other thing that being in the effect, or what the ritual effects will create, is it regulates the autonomic nervous system. Breath is part of the autonomic nervous system. So if you find that your breath is being regulated, you find you're in a really nice rhythm of deep breath, slow out breath, exhale. This is actually changing how your autonomic nervous system is functioning. What it's doing is taking you from a sympathetic, alert, active state into parasympathetic, which is also called rest and digest. The rest part is what we want to focus on. It's a calm, it's a balance, it's an even heartbeat, even breath, which I'm going to be bringing those up in a minute. So you're altering emotional tone as well. Thought creates emotional tone. Part of what you're trying to do in these rituals is you're trying to erase thought. Again, you can't get to quiet mind unless you're really well practiced. And it's not about eliminating emotion. It's about altering the emotional tone to the state of the spiritual experience, which is a more calm, balanced state. I'm going to talk about the neurotransmitters that are involved in that. And then perception feels set apart from ordinary experience. So everything I just described, the way I was describing the noise that surrounds us, right? What we're doing is we're changing the perception of what that noise means to our senses. We're, in a way, separating ourselves, but separation isn't really what's happening. But the sense, the feeling, the perception is that you are separating from that experience. Now we get into the neuroscience of the biological pathways that are engaged during these ritual states. So sensory pathways modulate attention and salience. Salience is what we find important in our perception. And so the things that are important when you're active are basically about survival and place in the real world. And your place in the real world has to be aware of everything that's surrounding you. So when you walk outside, your perception is about real world situations, traffic coming, people, trees, whatever it is that you're walking through or walking around or being in or involved in. Your awareness is in that environment. When you want to get into a spiritual state, you want to modulate that attention. You want to modulate what is important in your environment. And so one of the things that's happening from a biological perspective is that the sensory pathways are being changed. They're being modulated. Limbic system integrates emotion and memory. Limbic system is a topic that comes up a lot in the aromatherapy world, because when we talk about inhaling essential oils, we generally are talking about a limbic system response. You inhale, the molecules bind with the olfactory nerves. It goes signaling, not the molecule, but the signaling is going through the olfactory bulb and into the limbic system. And in the limbic system, which is kind of like a relay system, it's saying, okay, that oil has sent me this message, and so that message needs to trigger this neurotransmitter. That's, in a way, what's happening in the limbic system. When we get into a spiritual state, we are also manipulating, triggering limbic system response. And in the limbic system, we are dealing directly where emotion and memory are stored. So our spiritual experience is also having an emotional memory response. The autonomic nervous system, as I've talked about already, it shifts, and it shifts toward regulation. When we study essential oils in the olfactory system, actually studying the olfactory system, any scent, it doesn't even have to be essential oils. Essential oils or any scent through the limbic system also triggers autonomic shifts. This is the beauty of working with essential oils and scent, is that if the scent has a positive memory emotion, it can also trigger raising parasympathetic or calm rest and digest mode in the body, slowing down heart rate, helping digestion, even breathing. These are all the things that the autonomic nervous system will help bring into a regulated state, which is directed through the limbic system. Now, breath, heart rhythms synchronize. So basically, I already said that. Autonomic nervous function, that's what we're talking about. If you get into a parasympathetic state, you're regulating heart rate, you're regulating the breath. So kind of redundant, right? I already said it. I just gave you a bullet point that repeats it because it's so important. The neurochemical signaling supports mood and focus. So when we talk about limbic system and, like I said about scent and also a meditative spiritual experience, it's going to release certain neurotransmitters, dopamine, GABA, these, feel good molecules that when they are released in our body, bind with cells and receptors that trigger a response that makes us feel good. Feeling good is an emotional, but it's also a physical state. And these are some of the pathways that a spiritual experience will bring to you. Now, I was explaining all that, but I was I meant to say that this is historical, what we know about the practice of spirituality, what gets us there and where it's going. And so the practices over, just centuries, years and years and years and years, have developed into how we still use that, which hasn't changed a whole lot, right? So we still have ritual, we still have prayer, we still have meditation, and we still have the aromatics. A lot of the aromatics that were used historically in the practices that have been carried throughout the historical text to tell us how people did this. How were they accomplishing spiritual experience? Aromatics was a big way of getting there. So neurofeedback, we have the neurofeedback and the biofeedback devices now. And do these really bring you into a spiritual state? That can be debated if you want to call that a spiritual state, but it can be, because what these biofeedback type devices do is it gives us an awareness that allows us to control the neurotransmitters that we release, the different states that we want to get into. So we can learn, and I think we learn this through meditation. We learn how to bring us into what meditation does for us at the time of meditation. So when you're stressed out, if you take just a second to breathe and just think, I'm meditating, even though I'm active and I'm working, the meditative idea, the awareness of what that feels like, can help bring us into parasympathetic state, balance, and this is spiritual state that we're talking about. There are light-based regulation tools, which there's a lot going on now with light. Colors are shown to create different emotional states, different spiritual states. And so light can be used to help support or actually be part of a ritual to get into a spiritual state. There is an aspect to this which, psychedelics, which I haven't mentioned yet, but psychedelics, that's borderline bringing you to a spiritual perception. It is very different. But what psychedelics and psychotropic plants do is they show us in a way that our senses are lying. And when we can drop into that altered state of consciousness that psychotropic plants bring us into, we can go into a very spiritual space. A lot of people talk about, doing mushrooms or whatever and coming out with a more spiritual feeling of their essence, of their reality. And part of that is due to, I did a lot of psychedelics when I was a kid. And one of the things that I realized while I was doing that is that our senses lie to us. Because when you are doing these psychedelics, they physically alter you. It's a lot more aggressive than meditation and these other rituals that I think are much more harmonious to bring us into that spiritual state. But the psychotropics can introduce us to it and allow us to see that, well, my senses are lying. They're feeding me all this information, but all that information isn't all that accurate. And so it's part of where this altered state of consciousness goes. Now, Andrew Weil wrote a book called Marriage of the Sun and the Moon. It's all about altered states. He'll talk about coffee. He'll talk about mangoes. He'll talk about you eating that first bite of food and it puts you into an altered state. These are spiritual experiences. These are spiritual states of consciousness. And so when I talk about psychotropic plants, that is what they're doing. Now, I read a book, and I was trying to find the title, I can't remember, but I do remember this one piece where they took half a ping pong ball, put it on either eye, and shined a light. So that's why this topic came up under light-based regulation tools. Shining a light directly on it made it where the eyes we're not having any changes. And even when we sleep, there's light alterations that where our eyes are still active. But this experiment, shining a light with ping pong balls, was one steady beam, no change in the frequency. And because there was no change in the frequency, the mind automatically went into an altered state of consciousness. And so light therapy, from that perspective, can bring you into that altered state, which is what a spiritual experience is all about. Lots of sound and vibration technology, sound therapy and sound baths and things like that. We're seeing that a lot in wellness centers. And then the wearable nervous system monitors, like an Oura Ring or whatever. And, how these things, it kind of goes back to biofeedback. The more aware we are of our neurobiology, our physiology, the more we can alter it, control it, manipulate it, which again is what meditation and rituals are all about. Just want to see if anybody has any comments here. Jelena, thank you so much. You're here. I love it when you guys think this is so cool. I think it's so cool too. And I appreciate you saying that. Anyway, aromatics and spiritual practice today. This is my world. My world is all about scent. My world is all about aromatics. And the aromatics do not have to be natural. When it comes to the olfactory system, any scent works. When it comes to my work, because there are differences, my work, and I will emphasize that we want to use the tools that were historically used. And those were plant-based aromatics. We didn't have synthetics thousands of years ago. So plant-based aromatics, and of course they come from nature. It's who we are. We are nature. So there is a harmony, there's a resonance, there's a connection that we're working with here. In the form, the easiest form that we have right now would be essential oils and incense. So those are the two main ways that we can experience scent to produce the spiritual experience. But this is what we'll define as aromatics right now. So prayer and devotional practice, it's church with the frankincense, it's still there. And so the aromatics are a part of bringing us deeper into that prayer, bringing us deeper into the devotional practice, bringing us deeper into erasing intellectual noise. It's the experience. We're not intellectualizing. We're not explaining it. We're going deep into the feeling and the experience without trying to explain it, without trying to define it, without even trying to get there. We want to just fall into it. Meditation, I've mentioned that a million times because it's absolutely one of the best ways to have what we would consider, from the definition that I'm using or the perspective that I'm using today, it's the way to get there. It's the way to get rid of the noise. It's the way to bypass intellectual disruption. Meditation. Such a beautiful thing, and it's so powerful. And I talk about this from experience. I meditated for years, and then I just stopped doing it. And I really noticed a shift in my not so much my perception, but my stress levels. Let's just put it there. I was much easier physically felt stress, but when I started meditating again, stress, whatever, it's you deal with the things that stress you out, but you don't have to create the thought process of stress. Excuse me. So, protection and boundary setting. In Native American practice, and actually a lot of traditional practices throughout the world, there's smudging or there's cleansing with smoke. And so you're energetically clearing using smoke. You're energetically clearing. If you have a diffuser going, you're energetically cleansing the area with the smoke, with the diffusion of whatever fragrances. In some cultures, hang rosemary over a door or garlic, and those are used as a protective mechanism. So we're protecting against negative energy more so than a physical energy. And what's interesting, though, is that some of these smoke and some of these essential oils that we're using, of course, protect your immune system. And so they do protect your health as well. So the space clearing ritual transition, that is, again, when I was talking protection, but there's a lot more that can go on depending on the practice, right? So there are certain practices that are put together for this, for rituals, for spiritual process, however you want to define it. And, it's herbs, oils, resins, smoke. Personal grounding and emotional regulation. So we do have grounding exercises. If you do yoga, there's always at the beginning, we try to ground our energy, as we like to define it. And grounding that energy is part of the spiritual practice. So what does that mean, grounding? What does it mean? I don't know. I know what it feels like. I know what it feels like when I'm scattered and all up in my head. And I know what it feels like when I decide I'm going to ground that energy. From a neuroscientific perspective, I don't know what that means. That might be something I'm going to do some research on. See if anyone has ever done any kind of research and finding what the physical state is, and then testing again after doing a grounding practice, or just even grounding with essential oil. Be interesting to see if the physiology changes. Now, we have essential oils and aromatics that influence internal states. Internal states is what we're talking about. We're not talking about what's happening to you externally. Everything about this is very, very internalized in what our body is doing and what our mind is doing and what we are experiencing and feeling when we say we are having a spiritual experience. So, olfactory system, I mentioned this at the beginning, the olfactory system plays a major role in what's happening to the body during these spiritual experiences. So the olfactory system, as I mentioned earlier, it goes in, triggers a response in the limbic system and in the autonomic nervous system. So both of these are triggering neurotransmitter release, which is triggering a physical response in the body. That physical response, before we intellectualize and try to define it, it's creating an escape in a way from the outside physical world. It's allowing us to drop into a space that isn't about what we need to do, isn't about, the work that we're doing or the people that we're associating with or anything else in our physical life. It's allowing us to dissolve those boundaries. I always found that quantum physics, the pseudoscientific end of quantum physics, was a really interesting way to feel and understand a spiritual experience, because spiritual experiences cannot be defined intellectually, because just like when I was describing smell, it's not going through the intellectual centers. So any description that we have of a spiritual experience is not really describing it. It's describing a language that we create to define that. In quantum physics, they say that there is no language that defines quantum physics. And I would say mostly because we don't have any kind of sense, our sight, our sound, whatever. It doesn't feel, see, smell, whatever. It doesn't get to that quantum aspect of things. So we don't have a language. Mathematics is the language. And so when I started reading about quantum physics, it really matched my personal definition in the way I'm explaining spiritual experience here. It's what I call going on the other side of the wall. And going on the other side of the wall, it's that, time doesn't exist. Time is not real. Time is an experience. The other side of the wall, where it's a wave and it's a particle, as they talk about in the quantum subatomic particles. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. It just means I don't know. But it means it's something I can't intellectualize. It means I can't experience it. But in that spiritual state, that matches how I feel and how I like to explain the quantum aspect of things. And I also think this is where we get into, very ancient practices of spirituality. And when humans, before we were, in these concrete boundaries and walls, and our whole world was so hardcore physical that it's hard to get out of that. In a world that was all about nature, you were living in nature, you belonged to nature. And in that experience, when you experience something spiritual, I think you can communicate with it easier. But you also see where the intellectualization comes in. We have these experiences, but then we want to humanize it, and so gods are created, and snake in the trees, it's mostly South American traditional practices. I mean, there's all of these different pieces to a spiritual experience that then become stories. They become the ritual, definition of the ritual. The stories that are passed on, the religions and the Gospels and the Quran and everything else all came from the human experience of spirituality, but the words themselves are the intellectual experience of that experience, or the intellectual definition or explanation of the spiritual experience. So the olfactory system, along with the ritual, allows us to really engage and escape all those definitions, escape all of those words that may get into our brain. No thalamic relay or cognitive processing required. It's that no thalamic relay that means it bypasses the intellectual center. And so the response is immediate. When you smell something and a little streaming video goes off in your head, you get that memory, that very vivid memory, before there's an intellectual evaluation. You intellectualize it and describe it after you experience it. That's the best way to understand this aspect that I'm talking about, where it's pre-intellectualization, pre-definition, before. All comes before. That little video, boom, that goes off before you can think about it. When you smell smoke, when you walk in, I talk about this a lot with the olfactory training that I do. When you walk into a room and you smell smoke, you don't go, what is that? What is that? I know that smell. It's, and, before you define it, your toes are burning off, right? You immediately react because you have the memory and the emotion. The emotion triggers fight or flight. The memory is that I need to do something about this. And my memory knows once it gets to the intellectual center, it's just fire. You need to take care of it. This is also a spiritual experience. It gets you into a space where you don't have those definitions, and you want to ignore the definitions while you're in that state. So the sensory input alters attention and perception. I've defined that in so many different ways. Let's look at some of the herbs and now essential oils that we use that have been in traditional practice and rituals and any kind of religious practice. Frankincense being one of the most popular. When you smell frankincense, and this can be through the smoke or when they burn the resin, or through a diffuser, or just smelling it, right? You have a bottle and you smell it, you're getting the experience. So what frankincense does, and this is through neuroscientific evaluation when they research essential oils, it modulates the limbic activity, meaning that, and when I'm going to say the next word, slows respiration. If it slows respiration, it means it is raising parasympathetic activity. Now, there's also a memory association. If you've experienced frankincense in a spiritual, ritualistic way, you've created a memory association that will also be triggered to bring you into that spiritual, relaxed, altered state in a way. Also helps focus. This is a good thing, and this is why fragrance is such a good thing for ritual practice. If you focus on the scent, like having a fire, like having any kind of mural or whatever it is you're focused on, a point of attention. Scent can be that point of attention. And so when you're smelling, you're paying attention, which the limbic system response and neurotransmitters are being released. And the practice of going into that space, the more you do it, the easier it is to get there. Frankincense is a great oil for all of these things, right? Now, sandalwood, and I'm talking about Santalum album, which is the more common Indian sandalwood. But you can use the Australian sandalwood, which is Santalum spicatum. I don't have all the botanical names here, which I really should, but I don't because I only have so much space on these screens. So sandalwood reduces cortical overactivation. So basically what you're doing is you're calming the mind. You're calming brain activity. Frankincense does that as well. And it's supporting the sustained attention. So we're, basically I'm going to be saying the same thing about all of these, right? Himalayan cedarwood. I generally use Atlas cedarwood, but Himalayan just sounds so spiritual, so I decided to put that one up there. They're very similar in their use and very similar in their chemical structure. So you get a lot of the same responses. They even smell very similar. So the Himalayan or the Atlas cedarwood, here it is, parasympathetic tone. If you breathe it and you're regulating heart rate, regulating digestion, regulating the breath, you are regulating parasympathetic activity. Basically, if you're slowing things down to regulate it because you're in a hyper state, everything's fast, then that is raising parasympathetic activity and lowering sympathetic activity. So you're stabilizing sensory perception is what you're doing with these oils. Elemi. I really love elemi. It's very similar to myrrh. I could have put myrrh on this list too, but myrrh kind of coincides with frankincense, and then also the definition of what I'm going to tell you here about elemi. It's also supporting attention. This is going through the limbic system. It's calming. So the neuroscience behind these, there is a physiological response when you are smelling these oils, even if it's an incense. When you're smelling them, You're taking this information and you're releasing neurotransmitters. I'm basically saying all the same thing. The needle trees are also really good in spiritual practice. Juniper sharpens sensory awareness. Now, do we really want to sharpen sensory awareness? Yes, but not in that attention to the outside world. We want the sensory, we actually want to focus on the feelings of that spiritual experience. And so when we sharpen the sensory awareness, we're sharpening the sensory awareness of a spiritual neurotransmitter, neurophysiology experience. Pine helps the respiratory system, which helps with the regulating the breath, which is, if you work on the breath, you're also working on the autonomic nervous system. And then pine also, nervous system state. A lot of these are similar. I just kind of tried to define them differently. So it would be a little more interesting just saying the same thing, which I almost did anyway. So here's a process for moving from scent to state. This is the way you drop into the spiritual experience, okay? We're talking about intention. Intention is a powerful healing tool. Intention should be used by every therapist. And actually, whether you know it or not, if you explain to your client what you're doing, what your process is, what the expectation is, you're creating an intention. Intention is powerful. Sometimes intention is called placebo. Placebo is a real healing modality. Intention can help a placebo response. So there is a healing to intention. There is also an intention of getting into that spiritual state. The intention should be clear, and what is it you want to do for your spiritual practice? Are you trying to create stillness? Are you trying to be grounded? Is it about energetic protection that you're trying to create? Are you looking for more clarity, emotional clarity, intellectual clarity, and spiritual clarity? What is the intention behind your practice? And then the physiology. What is it you need to shift? Part of what I hear a lot of people talk about when they're meditating, which is one of the more common spiritual practices, what are you trying to shift? It's monkey mind, intellectual noise, that blah, 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 that keeps you awake at night, that creates conflict in relationship with work people, with whatever. It's that blah, blah, blah kind of stuff that you want to shift that noise. So your spiritual practice may be focused on that. Do you want to regulate your breath? Are you finding that your breathing is short and quick? If that's what your practice is about, that would be your focus, your point of focus, your intention. The emotional tone, that's basically the monkey mind. But, if you find yourself stressed, or if you find yourself in these states where you really need to regulate some of that fear or anxiety or whatever you're feeling, negative emotions, that's part of what you're trying to create from a physiological perspective. The aromatic category, excuse me again, what plant supports that? Now, this can be from a lot of different perspectives. It could be in its scent. It could be in the plant's place geographically, or the plant itself and who it is and what it is. Like when I talk about stability, so if your intention is that you want to be more stable, and the physiology is that your body always feels a little shaky and never grounded. And so that's the physiology you're trying to create. So what will be the aromatic category? Look at a tree. Trees are very well grounded, their root system. And then they tend to be fairly tall with a very strong trunk that holds up this connective needles or leaves or stems and sticks that create that relationship with the air element, with the higher levels. When you take the wood oil and use that, from my intention, from the physiology that I'm trying to create, a wood oil creates stability. The tree is stable. The tree is strong. The wood oil, it's going to be creating stability. It's going to create strength. Resin, wood, root, spice, you can define these any way you want. Now, as an educator, I would give you lots of different ways and lots of different ways to choose. But I'm giving you an overview right now. We can do this other stuff later. Your method, how do you want to use it? Put it in a diffuser. Put it on a tissue and put it by your meditation place or in your whatever your practice is, your yoga. You can put drops on and do a thing for your chakras. However you want to do this, your application, how do you want to smell it? How do you want to feel it? You're using incense. Are you putting it into a bowl that burns the resin? So many different ways that you can use these aromatics to create a spiritual state. So what I've just given you is an overview of understanding spirituality from a perspective of using ritual and using practice and using aromatics. More specifically for me, it's the essential oil that's traditionally used in aromatics. And so the practice in everything that I just showed you, this is the start. Your intention, the physiology. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to be? Who do you want to be? And in a way, from a spiritual perspective, you want to be nobody, because in that quantum realm, we are all interconnected. I could get into souls and everything else when I start talking about this, because I have a whole different definition for that aspect of who we are as a soul. But there's that interconnected space, right? That quantum space, that spiritual space, that altered state, And so the things that I've just described to you are different ways for you to get there, but you do need to create your own definition, because we all have a definition. I gave you mine in a way, right? But we all have one. So we want to know what we're defining. We want to know what we're creating. We want to know what we're feeling. So everything I've just done gives you, in a way, a structure. It's an experience way to work. Experience is a big thing. And it's an experience using scent. And it's in wellness, education, and professional settings. Now, I'm really talking right now to people who work as a therapist. And if you have a spa, a resort, guess what? I'm around. I'm available. Here's what I do. I like to bring these practices, and I love to do guest workshops. I train your staff. I'll train you, if it's just you. But I have educational profiles that really gets deeper into the essential oils, how to use them specifically, but also do these workshops that are just like this, except we're going to be passing out oils the whole time, and then even creating a blend at the end of it using these oils. So we do that. We do a spiritual practice using essential oils and creating a spiritual space in these workshops that I do. I do a lot of different workshops, storytelling, all kinds of things. And I want to bring that, to where you are, right? So I do staff training, education for your staff, the visiting expert sessions for the guests. Love to do retreats, bring me out to your retreat. I can do different pieces of this and grow it throughout the retreat process. So we start from the process of understanding, and then start bringing in the neuroscience and all of these steps that I just gave you. Also do this for corporate wellness, because when you're in a corporate workplace, how do you bring spirituality into that? And I think it's so key and so important. The definition that I've given you is no definition. And that's a good place when you're doing corporate spirituality. You're trying to create that element where we all have an understanding that it's a much bigger picture than this physical workspace reality that we have. We're working and we're doing, but instead of getting all trapped into definitions and trapped into emotions and trapped into defining, a spiritual space allows us to deal with whatever comes up and to deal in more harmony. So I thank you oh so much. And all the people that are here and talking to me. I love that. You're from New Zealand. Cool. I want to go to New Zealand. And yeah, invite me down. I love it. So this is what Carrie and Genos, your Abies balsamia, which is the balsam fir. Use it with intention. Yeah. Balsam fir is another great one. Have you noticed that the Christmas trees, if you get a really beautiful Christmas tree that's still fairly fresh, and you have that in your room, you are creating an aromatic spiritual experience based on the idea of how we define Christmas and what we know about the Christmas holiday. And Christmas holiday has gone beyond a religious holiday, and which is a beautiful thing, because the birth of Jesus is what's celebrated with the word Christmas, but not everybody is Christian. But because we're all celebrating that day, it just creates a connection, and it goes beyond all the religious definitions. So it really does what the teachings of Jesus were all about, which is about harmony, love, compassion, and connection. So the celebration that we're having on December 25th is not necessarily only about the birth of Jesus. It's about the teachings of Jesus. And I think we all experience those very well. Anyway, connect with me. Give me a DM if you're here on LinkedIn. Give me a subscribe and a like if you're on YouTube. And if you want to talk to me, I'm here, Jim@jimharrison.com. And I actually gave you my other email, info@jimharrison. So either one gets to me. And, hi from Poland. Cool, man. Hi. You guys are awesome from around the world. You're up kind of late too. Love that. Anyway, I'm going to let you go. And I really appreciate that you all join me. If you do have any questions about this, please, send me a DM, email me, connect with me, comments on YouTube, comments here on the live stream for LinkedIn. You can share this as well. Repost it on LinkedIn, share it, and connect on YouTube. This is all the promotional stuff, right? That you're supposed to do. You ever watch those guys? I'm not going to go into the whole YouTube marketing thing. But anyway, yes, love you guys. And I really look forward to doing this again very soon. Thank you for joining me.